I didn't understand why my husband had never gone to register our marriage until the moment I saw the marriage certificate between him and his younger sister Emily. Only then did I realize the real reason Mark had always refused to make our marriage official. I went mad and demanded an explanation. Emily covered her face and gasped, refusing to say a word, while Mark said impatiently, "Don't make it sound so ugly. Emily and I aren't related by blood. And besides, you and I never registered our marriage. To be exact, you're the other woman here." Their children, those ungrateful brats, rolled their eyes at me and snapped, "That's enough. You were never good enough for our dad anyway. They're legally married. Because of you, they couldn't live openly. They're the real victims, not you." Those words hit me like knives. My chest ached, and my heart condition flared up, but not a single one of them came to help me. When I opened my eyes again, I heard Mark's voice once more, saying again that we wouldn't register or hold a proper wedding. This time I grabbed a broom and drove the two of them out of the house, then turned around and went next door. Looking at the man standing there, I asked quietly, "Does our engagement still count?" My soon-to-be sister-in-law and close friend Emily gently took my hand and said, "Whether you two register or not doesn't matter at all. In my heart, you'll always be my only sister-in-law. In my brother's heart, you'll always be his one true love. Isn't that enough? Besides, you already held the banquet. Everyone around here knows you two are married. People call you the college student's wife. That sounds grand enough, doesn't it? Why bother with a marriage certificate?" Mark sat off to the side, looking visibly annoyed, but both he and Emily had the same expectant look in their eyes. They were just waiting for me to nod. Seeing this familiar scene, I froze. Wait, wasn't I dead? I turned stiffly toward the mirror beside me. The reflection staring back wasn't the bent, wrinkled woman in her 50s that I remembered. It was a young woman barely in her 20s. In that instant, I understood. I had been reborn. In my previous life, it was because of Emily's soft-spoken persuasion that I agreed not to register the marriage. After a small banquet, I foolishly became Mark's wife. After marrying him, I supported him through college, then later used my money to send Emily to school as well. I took care of the two of them like a maid and even gave birth to a pair of outstanding children for Mark. But 30 years later, I finally learned the truth. Mark and Emily weren't blood siblings at all. They only pretended to be brother and sister in public. Behind closed doors, they were legally married. I had devoted my entire life to them, and in the end, I became the mistress, the other woman, and was literally driven to death by rage. The thought of it filled me with such hatred that I wanted to grab the kitchen knife I had just bought and chop the two of them into pieces. But I forced myself to calm down. First, it wasn't easy being reborn. Second, I couldn't win against the two of them anyway. So I pulled my hand out of Emily's grasp, let out a cold laugh, and said, "Fine, then we won't register." Emily and Mark looked at each other. But before either of them could speak, I sneered again and added, "Anyway, it's not like I have to marry into your family." "What's that supposed to mean?" Mark shot to his feet, sneering. "You think playing hard to get is fun? Do you know how many girls are lining up for me? I didn't even bother to meet any of them. I chose you. And now you're throwing a tantrum over a marriage certificate? Let me tell you something, Claire. Look at yourself, an orphan. A college guy like me being willing to marry you is me doing you a favor, not the other way around." Mark's arrogance wasn't baseless. He was handsome, and though his grades were mediocre and his family was poor, he somehow got into college and became the pride of his hometown. My own family was well off, but for the past 2 years, I had been the one chasing after him, cooking for him, doing his laundry, cleaning his house, and spending money on him without complaint. And yes, Mark was right about one thing. Being an orphan didn't make me exactly popular on the marriage market. But Mark had forgotten the most important fact. I had money. And it wasn't an exaggeration to say that, in the 1980s, I was the only person around who could afford to eat meat at every meal. If it weren't for me, how could Mark and Emily have lived so comfortably and gone off to school without a care in the world? How could they have climbed so high above others? The thought made my expression twist in disdain. People always say a princess never worries about finding a husband. Well, I wasn't a princess, but everyone knew I was the most eligible woman for miles around. No matter who I married, that man's family would rise in status overnight. So how was it that you were the one losing out, Mark? Don't you dare act like some poor victim living off a woman's money. I'm not the least bit interested in a so-called college man like you. Emily froze, then gave me an awkward smile. Claire? She started, but before she could finish, Mark barked. Emily, let's go. Don't bother with her. Just wait, within 3 days she'll come begging me to forgive her. Sure, she might have money, but without me, she won't be able to keep it. With that, Mark didn't give me a chance to respond. He laced his fingers tightly with Emily's and stormed off. Watching the two of them leave hand in hand, all I felt was bitter irony. How blind had I been in my past life not to notice something was wrong between them? Yet even after they left, I didn't feel relieved. Because Mark wasn't entirely wrong. Our marriage, in truth, had been mutually beneficial. It wasn't only because I'd been stupidly in love with him, it was because I needed him. To be precise, I needed to get married. My parents had died of illness, leaving me a considerable inheritance. If this had been 30 years later, I wouldn't have needed a husband at all. But back then, things were different. My relatives were circling like vultures, already setting me up with men of their choosing, waiting for me to marry so they could get their hands on my fortune. The only way to stop them was to marry a strong man, someone capable of keeping them in check. Mark wasn't exactly the live-in son-in-law I'd imagined, but he was a college student. That alone made people too intimidated to mess with me. In my previous life, it was exactly because of that Mark and Emily were able to pressure me into agreeing to a marriage without registration. I hadn't wanted to, but to protect my parents' property, I foolishly gave in and married Mark without a certificate. There's a saying, a man fears choosing the wrong career, a woman fears marrying the wrong man. In my past life, I married the wrong man, Mark, and it killed me. But in this life, if I didn't marry him, who could I marry instead? Leaving aside whether I even wanted to, who would be willing to risk offending both my greedy relatives and a college student for the sake of a woman who'd already been in a relationship with another man? The next few days were a standoff. Mark waited for me to come apologize. Emily came by several times, probably wanting to persuade me again like before, but I never opened the door. Truthfully, I was too preoccupied, pacing the floor, lost in thought, not knowing what to do. I was in no mood to waste words on them. Then one afternoon, I heard barking from next door, and it suddenly hit me. Right, him. I killed a chicken, made a pot of soup, dressed up neatly, and went to knock on the neighbor's door. The words I'd planned to say got stuck in my throat out of embarrassment, and after hesitating for what felt like forever, I finally managed to stammer out, "Does our engagement still count?" My neighbor, Jason, froze, scratching his head with a confused look. "Our engagement still counts?" he repeated blankly. "You mean, you should know about it, right? We were betrothed before birth, our parents arranged it. Even though they're gone now, you remember that, don't you?" The truth was, I did remember. I had spent days agonizing over what to do, and when I heard Jason's dog barking earlier, I suddenly thought of him. Jason and I had grown up next door to each other. Our parents had been close friends long before we were born, and back then, they'd jokingly agreed to a childhood engagement between us. I never hated Jason, but I'd always told myself I wasn't some girl from the old days. I wanted to choose my own husband, so I'd refused to acknowledge the engagement, and since both families had treated it as a joke, no one pushed it. Later, Jason's parents passed away, and with society moving toward free love and marriage by choice, that old engagement became meaningless. Still, now that I'd thought it over carefully, coming to him made sense. He and I had grown up together. I knew his character inside and out. In my past life, when I suffered under Mark and Emily, Jason had even stood up for me once. Sadly, not long after that, he jumped into a river and took his own life. If he could marry me, I could save myself, maybe even save him from the suicide he once committed. That would be 2 birds with 1 stone. I handed Jason the chicken soup and said, "Believe me, marrying me won't be a loss." I had a whole basket full of things I wanted to keep saying, but Jason just smiled and nodded. "Okay, then let's get married," he said. Then he put the bowl of soup back into my hands. You should drink this. You've seemed unsettled the past few days. You've lost weight. I touched my face. Lost weight? I didn't notice. Besides, in my last life, Mark kept saying I was too fat, that my face was too round, forcing me to eat less. I always thought I really was fat, but now I realize that in the eyes of someone who actually cares about me, I'm thin. I drank the soup in one go. Maybe because of the tears it tasted a little salty. After finishing it, worried I'd wake from the dream, I pulled Jason straight to the registry office. Before long, we had our own marriage certificate. Seeing my name finally on that paper, I couldn't help but feel emotional. The thing I'd waited my whole life for was finally in my hands, and I couldn't stop the tears. Jason jumped, startled. "Why are you crying? If you regret it, don't hold it in. We can go and get a divorce right away. I can tell them I forced you into this marriage with the childhood engagement." I cried even harder, and Jason hurried on. "Don't worry. If Mark misunderstood, I can explain it to him." I shook my head. "No, I'm happy. If there's any regret, it's that in my last life I didn't notice how good you were to me." Wiping my eyes, I said seriously, "But from now on, you have to listen to me about everything. Tell me when something's wrong. Don't keep it inside, and don't ever think of taking your own life." Jason nodded over and over. We didn't go straight home. We started arranging the wedding. We split up. One of us went around telling everyone we were getting married and invited them to the ceremony. The other went to hire people to arrange the banquet. Before long, the whole countryside knew I was having a wedding. In these days, chances to eat well were rare, so everyone was excited. Word of my banquet soon reached Mark and Emily. When I went out to borrow tables and chairs, Mark and Emily suddenly appeared in front of me and blocked my way. "Ha! Weren't you not going to marry me?" Emily taunted. "Aren't you obediently preparing the banquet now?" I frowned and opened my mouth to answer, but Mark waved his hand and cut me off. "All right, you don't need to apologize. I'm not really angry, but as punishment, the wedding banquet must be canceled." As soon as he finished, Emily stepped forward, smiled, and said, "Sister-in-law, we're not saying cancel the banquet, just make it smaller. Think about it. My brother just got into college and he's being so flashy. People will talk. Besides, you're spending so much, and my brother's schooling costs a lot. You're probably going to have kids too, and that'll be more expenses. So go tell everyone not to come. We'll just invite a few relatives." I couldn't hold back. I sat down right on the chair and snapped. "Mark, Emily, are you crazy? It's my money. What does it have to do with you? My paying for your brother's schooling has nothing to do with me. He's not my son. Am I supposed to support him? And don't call me sister-in-law from now on. This wedding and I have nothing to do with you. Do you understand?" As soon as I said that, I nearly blew Mark's top. "What are you talking about? How is it not my business? You're throwing the banquet. I'm the groom. My woman and your money, they're both mine. How could any of that not be related to me? Are you out of your mind?" Mark's face twisted with fury. "I was thinking, since you'd already lowered yourself and started preparing the wedding banquet, I might as well forgive you. But since you've gone completely crazy, let me make this clear. I'm not going to your wedding. I suggest you cancel it immediately. Otherwise, the one who will be humiliated is you." Before I could even get the words, "You lunatic," out, Mark grabbed Emily's hand and stormed off again. After that day, he didn't come looking for me anymore. He probably thought I'd grown too arrogant, that I didn't know my place, and decided he needed to teach me a lesson somehow. Emily, on the other hand, came by several times. But knowing those two as well as I did, I could tell she was only there as his messenger, repeating whatever Mark had told her to say. Her lines were practically the same every time. "Claire, my brother was just joking when he said all that. Of course we'll come to the banquet. But when my brother arrives, you'd better apologize properly. You've made him angry again and again. That's your fault. Don't think apologizing is shameful. Once you marry him, you'll be the wife of a college student. Everyone will envy you. Oh, and by the way, the new semester's about to start. You should hurry and give my brother his tuition money. You two can argue all you want, but you're getting married soon. Don't let it delay his studies." Each time, I explained to Emily as clearly as I could, but she never believed me. She thought I was lying to trick Mark into registering the marriage. I was busy preparing for the banquet anyway, so after refusing to hand over any money, I stopped entertaining her visits altogether. Emily seemed worried at first, but when she saw the red lanterns I'd ordered, with the characters Zhang and Chen printed on them, she assumed I was bluffing and stopped coming by. Soon, the wedding day arrived. Guests from all over the surrounding villages came to celebrate. If I hadn't had the wall between my courtyard and Jason's torn down, we wouldn't have had enough room for everyone. Halfway through the banquet, Mark and Emily finally appeared, long after everything had started. When Mark saw that the guests were already eating and drinking, he nearly exploded. Standing at the gate, he shouted, "Claire, are you insane? How could you start without me?" The guests were stunned. Whispers rippled through the crowd. "Why's he here? Didn't they break up? Why would he show up at her wedding? Something's off." "It's weird. Why would the bride wait for her ex to start the feast?" another said. "Look at him. He's even wearing red. Don't tell me he's here to crash the wedding." "You know what? He actually does look like a groom." Hearing the murmurs, Mark finally seemed to realize that this banquet wasn't for his wedding. He looked up and saw me and Jason, both dressed in wedding clothes, making a toast to our guests. His face went pale, then flushed with anger. "Claire, what the hell is this supposed to mean? I said I wasn't coming to the banquet, and you go and marry someone else in my place? Are you out of your mind?" Emily looked terrified. "Claire, come here right now. If you keep this up, my brother's really gonna get angry and I won't be able to help you." I frowned and said coldly, "Mark, look carefully. No one's replacing you. I'm marrying Jason. And don't give me that look. You're the one who said you wouldn't marry me, that you wanted to break up. You and I have nothing to do with each other anymore. Who I marry is none of your business." "Impossible," Mark roared, grabbing my hand like a madman. "How could you marry him? You loved me so much. We'd already picked a wedding date. How could you just turn around and marry someone else?" Jason immediately shoved Mark away and stepped in front of me protectively. "If you two came here to drink and celebrate," he said firmly, "then please, sit down." "If you two came here just to make a scene," Jason said sharply, his tone colder than I'd ever heard before, "then turn around and leave. I won't see you out." It was the first time I'd ever seen him lose his temper. In front of me, Jason had always been gentle and patient. He had never once raised his voice, let alone gotten angry. Mark, though visibly startled, still refused to back down. Standing stiffly to the side, he said, "Claire, I know I was wrong. Stop this nonsense. Come here and get him out of here. You and I are the real couple." I knew Mark could be arrogant, but I never imagined his confidence would reach this level. Even when everything was already final, he still thought I was pretending to marry someone else just to make him jealous. He actually believed that if he apologized, I would forgive him and go back to marrying him as if nothing had happened. Completely delusional. I ignored him. Instead, I went inside and came back out holding the marriage certificate Jason and I had just received. I didn't hand it to Mark, I gave it to the village chief. "Please take a look," I said. "Confirm for everyone that Jason and I are legally married. Tell us, what's wrong with us holding a wedding banquet?" The village chief examined the certificate, then walked over to Mark and said, "Mark, Claire and Jason really are husband and wife now. They even had a prior engagement arranged between their families. Even if you like her, you can't act like this. A real man doesn't behave so shamelessly." The onlookers chimed in immediately. "Yeah, just leave already. You're only embarrassing yourself." Mark stumbled a few steps backward, staring straight at me. "Claire, you really want me to leave?" he asked. I shook my head. His eyes lit up instantly, and Emily even sighed in relief. "I knew you wouldn't," she started to say, but I cut her off. "You can leave," I said coolly. "But that outfit you're wearing, I remember making it for you. I don't think you deserve to wear something I made, so take it off. I'll let Lucky wear it instead." "Lucky?" Mark repeated, confused for a moment, until my dog barked twice from the yard, tail wagging. Mark's face darkened instantly, and I could see the fury flash in his eyes. He finally realized I was mocking him, telling him he wasn't even as good as a dog. "Claire, you've gone too far," he hissed. I snorted. "What's wrong? You're a college man. Don't tell me you plan to keep my clothes." Mark was so furious he nearly fainted. His hands trembled as he tore off the red wedding clothes and threw them on the ground. "You'll regret this," he spat through gritted teeth before staggering away. Emily hesitated for a moment, then hurried after him. With those two gone, no one else tried to cause trouble, and the wedding banquet continued smoothly. That night, Jason took a quilt and said he'd sleep outside, but I stopped him. "You've been so good to me," I said softly. "Yes, I did date Mark before, but that's all in the past. We're married now, so you don't need to sleep separately." He still looked uncertain, probably thinking I'd only married him out of anger and would regret it later. Holding the quilt, he didn't move. I frowned. "What's wrong? If you won't stay here with me, does that mean you didn't marry me sincerely? Or that you're planning to divorce me already?" Jason shook his head quickly, stuffed the quilt back into the cabinet, and closed the door. That night, he was gentle. So gentle that I barely felt any pain. It was nothing like my wedding night in the last life. Back then, Mark had been rough and impatient, nearly hurting me to the point of fainting, and right after, he left me alone, saying he had to help Emily review her lessons. I didn't even get angry at the time. Instead, like a fool, I got up despite the pain to cook them a late-night snack. Thinking about it now, I could have slapped myself. Not only was this wedding night different, but my married life afterward was, too. Jason and I had no parents, which meant I didn't have to live like before. Waking up early to serve my in-laws, Mark and Emily. I could sleep until the sun was high and wake to the smell of breakfast that Jason had made for me. After living 2 lives, I finally understood what happiness felt like. This kind of life was something I had never even dared to dream of. But while Jason and I lived sweetly and peacefully, Mark's household was filled with tension and gloom. A few days later, Emily showed up at my door with tears streaming down her face. At first, I didn't even want to open it, but her crying was so loud that a crowd of neighbors had already gathered outside to watch. Reluctantly, I finally opened the door. It had only been a month since I'd last seen her, but Emily already looked haggard and exhausted, with visible bruises on her face. I couldn't help but find it ironic. Clearly, Mark had hit her. For all his college education, his character and conduct had never matched his supposed status. He was crude, violent, and short-tempered. I figured he must have blamed Emily for making him lose me, so he took it out on her. The irony stung. In my previous life, Mark felt guilty for marrying me and having children with me, thinking he owed Emily, so he treated her like some sacred first love, his white moonlight. Yet now, without me there as his lovesick fool, even that white moonlight was getting beaten. When Emily saw me, she nearly dropped to her knees. "Sister." "No, Claire," she sobbed. "Please go see my brother. He's really sick. I'm begging you. Go see him." My hatred for Mark and Emily was the same, but at this point, they hadn't even registered their marriage yet. I couldn't think of any better way to make them suffer, so I coldly shook off her hand. "If he's sick, go find a doctor. What do you want from me?" "I'm not one." Emily froze, clearly stunned. She had thought that even if I'd married out of anger, I must still love Mark, that hearing he was ill would make me rush to his side. She never expected this kind of cold indifference. When she still didn't leave, I smiled mockingly. "What? Don't tell me you're out of money again and came here hoping I'd give you some to pay the doctor. If that's what you're after, you've come to the wrong person. I'm not your fool anymore." As soon as I said that, the bystanders burst out laughing. Emily's face turned red, then white, then red again. Suddenly she shouted, "Claire, how can you be so shameless? You and my brother were already engaged. He rejected so many marriage proposals for you. And just because my family doesn't have money, you went off and married someone else without a word? Don't you think that's cruel? You and my brother may not have a certificate, but you were already husband and wife. What you did is called adultery, and in ancient times they'd have drowned you for it. No matter what era it is, being accused like that could ruin a woman's reputation forever." So as soon as the neighbors heard her words, they started whispering among themselves. "I always thought it was strange," one woman said. "Claire used to treat Mark so well." "Yeah, and then suddenly she up and married Jason. Makes no sense unless it was about money." "Oh my God, they were already married? Does that mean Claire?" As the gossip got uglier, Emily's smugness grew. But instead of getting angry or defensive, I let out a sob and suddenly dropped to my knees in front of her. "Emily, why would you say something like that?" I cried. "I've always treated you so kindly. How could you accuse me of this? It's true I dated your brother. Everyone knows that. But every single time we met, you were there. So what are you saying now? That the three of us did something indecent together?" Even as cunning as she tried to be, Emily was still only 18. She wasn't a match for me, a woman who'd lived over 50 years. Her face went pale as she stammered. "No, that's not what I meant. I just meant that our family already thought of you as my brother's wife." That only made me cry harder. "Emily, you were there the day your brother broke up with me. Some of the neighbors must have heard it too. He said, 'Marriage is fine, but no certificate.' Tell me, Emily, what was I lacking that made him say that? What, you expect me to marry you without a marriage certificate? Am I supposed to be your family's concubine now? Do you think just because you're a college student, you get to have 2 wives?" Emily stumbled back several steps, panicked. "The marriage certificate? We can still talk about it. But how could you just suddenly go and marry someone else like that?" Suddenly, Jason stepped out from the doorway and said evenly, "Claire and I have been engaged since we were children. Your family moved here later, so maybe you don't know, but all the other neighbors do. Your brother wanted to trick Claire into being his mistress and take her home without marriage. She refused, so she honored her old engagement with me. What's wrong with that?" With Jason by my side, my voice grew stronger. Emily didn't dare say another word. She covered her face and ran away in shame. After that exchange, the neighbors finally understood everything. It wasn't that I was fickle or unfaithful. It was Mark who had acted without conscience. Jason held my hand gently. "Claire, you've been wronged," he said. "Let's go to the police. We'll make him pay." I was about to nod, but the neighbors quickly surrounded me, tugging at my arms and trying to calm me down. "Claire, we know you've suffered, but Mark's a college student. He's going to be a government official someday. People always say you can't go up against the powerful. Don't stir up more trouble," one said. "Exactly," another added. "Mark's always treated his sister so well. If you go up against him, you'll only get hurt. You and Jason may have some money, but you're just ordinary folks. Everyone knows the truth now anyway, so let it go. Don't call the police." Jason's eyes darkened. He gripped my hand tighter and said through clenched teeth, "Even if I have to go to prison, even if it costs me my life, I won't let you suffer." I lowered my gaze. The truth was, ever since I'd been reborn, I had never stopped thinking about getting revenge on Mark and Emily. But how could I do it? What was I supposed to say, that they were secretly involved? Without evidence, who would ever believe me? After thinking for a while, I decided against going to the police. I pulled Jason back inside the house and said firmly, "No, we won't report it. Instead, we'll take the college entrance exams too." Jason looked uneasy and sighed. "I actually already took the exam once," he admitted, "but I didn't pass. Maybe I'm just not cut out for it." In my last life, I had been so obsessed with Mark that I hadn't even known Jason had tried to take the exam. Seeing the disappointment in his eyes, I patted his hand reassuringly. "Don't worry. If someone like Mark, that useless fool, could get in, you definitely can too. We'll study together, keep each other on track, and we'll make it." He still didn't seem too confident, but as always, he nodded obediently. "All right, I'll listen to you." And I wasn't exaggerating. In my past life, I'd studied hard just to have more to talk about with Mark. I'd even practiced exam papers. And my scores had been higher than his. I was sure that this time I could not only get into college myself but also help Jason do the same. As long as he wasn't too hopeless, we'd both succeed. So I bought study materials and began reviewing every day, tutoring Jason while studying alongside him. The more we studied, the more I realized just how smart he really was. With his aptitude and our dedication, I became certain we could both pass. The days that followed were peaceful. We shut out the world and focused solely on our books. Everything went smoothly until about a week before the new semester was set to begin, when Mark and Emily suddenly appeared again, shattering our calm life. Mark looked frantic. The moment I opened the door, he grabbed Emily's hand and pushed his way in. "Claire, I know I was wrong," he said breathlessly. "I'm willing to marry you now, to register officially. Just divorce Jason right away, and we'll get our certificate. I don't care that you married him. Let's go back to how we were before, all right? Of course, I knew he wasn't truly remorseful. I couldn't help but sneer inwardly. So, this is what it's really about, I thought. It's almost time for school to start. So you came to get back together with me. What, so I could pay your college tuition again? I asked coldly. Let me make this clear. That's impossible. Jason and I love each other very much. We are not getting divorced. When I finished speaking, I opened the door wide. Get out. Don't make me say it twice. But Mark and Emily didn't leave. They exchanged a glance, nodded to each other, and before I could react, Mark pulled out a knife and pressed it against my neck. Emily quickly slammed the door shut and locked it. The two of them forced me into a chair and tied me up. Having been given a second chance at life, I cherished it deeply, so I forced myself to stay calm. Mark, I said steadily, you worked so hard to get into college. Do you really want to throw your future away over something this stupid? My husband will be home soon. What you're doing right now is a crime. You both need to think this through. Emily let out a cold, mocking laugh. Don't pretend. We saw Jason leave on his bike before we came. He was heading somewhere important. He's not coming back anytime soon. Mark frowned at her. Enough talking. Let's just get this over with. A chill ran down my spine. What do you want, if it's money? But Mark cut me off. He unbuckled his belt and sneered. Money? I don't want your money. I want you. Once I sleep with you, I'll tell everyone you seduced me. They'll believe me, a college student, not some fickle woman who jumps from man to man. When Jason comes back, even if he loves you, he'll still divorce you. Then I'll marry you, and everything you have will belong to me. You'll work to support me through school and serve me for the rest of your life. Serve him for the rest of my life. The words stabbed through me like knives. Images of my previous life, years of humiliation and pain flashed before my eyes like a film reel. No. Not again. Not ever again. I thrashed wildly, screaming for help. Help, somebody. Before I could finish, Emily clamped her hand over my mouth. Hurry up, brother, she hissed. I struggled, kicking and twisting, but they held me down tightly. I couldn't make a sound. Just when I thought it was over, the front door burst open with a loud crash. Jason stormed in, grabbed Mark by the collar, and hurled him into the wall. The sound of the door being kicked in drew the attention of several neighbors, who began to gather outside. Jason tore off his jacket and draped it over my shoulders. His voice softened as he whispered, "It's okay now. It's over." Hearing his voice, steady and familiar, my trembling finally eased, but my clothes were disheveled and panic surged again. What if he misunderstood? I didn't, I blurted. You came just in time. Nothing happened. Jason cut me off gently. I believe you, he said firmly, and even if something had happened, it wouldn't change anything. I only care that you're safe. I don't blame you. This is my fault for not protecting you. Mark, groaning in pain, didn't dare say a word. He wasn't Jason's match, not physically, not morally, and now, with so many witnesses watching, he could do nothing. Emily knew it too. She rushed to help him up, trying to slip out quietly. But the neighbors, now realizing what had happened, blocked their way. Someone shouted to call the village chief. Let him handle this. When the chief arrived, Mark straightened his shoulders, trying to regain his arrogance. Claire invited me here. He declared loudly. We were having an affair. Adultery isn't a crime. Get out of the way. I'm a college student. Emily nodded furiously, backing him up. That's right. Claire called us over. She said she missed my brother. It was her idea. We didn't do anything illegal. Before she could finish, the village chief cut her off sharply. He pointed to the knife on the floor and the rope lying beside the chair. She invited you and told you to bring a knife and tie her up? What kind of nonsense is that? And if this was some affair, what's her sister-in-law doing here? Do you take us all for fools? Bookmark. Mark, you're the first college student our county's ever had. We all had such high hopes for you, and this is how you repay us? The village chief said bitterly. Jason had already calmed me down and now stepped forward to face the chief. You've seen what happened, he said firmly. He broke into our house illegally and tried to assault my wife. We have to report this to the police. Even if it costs me everything I have, I'll make sure justice is done. The moment Mark heard the word police, he snapped completely. "No, no, you can't call the police," he screamed, and without warning he grabbed the heavy metal weight from the nearby scale and swung it at Jason's head. I screamed, "Watch out!" But it was too late. Jason collapsed instantly, limp as a rag doll, and for a moment I thought my soul had left my body. But I forced myself not to panic. I fought to stay calm as the village chief, and I rushed Jason to the hospital. Thankfully, fate still seemed to be on our side. Though Jason lost a lot of blood, the doctors said it was only a mild concussion. He was unconscious for several days, but finally, he opened his eyes. I burst into tears, sobbing uncontrollably. To comfort me, he smiled weakly and said, "You know, while I was out, I kept dreaming. They were strange dreams, funny even, but you have to promise not to get mad when I tell you." I stopped crying and sniffled. "What kind of dreams?" Jason thought for a moment. "In my dream, you weren't my wife. You were pregnant, working in the fields early in the morning. You were so thin it broke my heart, but your belly was huge. I couldn't stand it and tried to help you, but it only made your husband yell at you." I froze. That wasn't a dream. That was my past life. I quickly asked, "And then, what else did you dream?" Seeing that I wasn't upset, Jason went on. "The rest is kind of blurry, but I remember being really angry. I went to find your husband. I think he'd taken something from me. I wanted him to give it back, but he refused. Then he hit me over the head and threw me into the river." He gave a faint laugh. "Maybe what he took was you. Maybe I was trying to get you back." My stomach churned violently. Could it be that in my previous life, Jason hadn't taken his own life at all? That Mark had murdered him? The thought chilled me to the core, but I said nothing. Instead, I excused myself to make him some food and fled from the hospital. I didn't go home. I went straight to the police station to find Mark. The moment he saw me, he collapsed to his knees, sobbing. "I was wrong. I was wrong. I don't want anything anymore. Just please forgive me. Claire, it wasn't my fault, it was Emily's. It was her idea, she pushed me to do it. It's all her fault. Please, talk to them for me. I'll owe you forever. When I graduate from college, I'll make it up to you, I swear." I ignored his pathetic begging and asked sharply, "Tell me the truth. Was that college admission letter you got actually Jason's?" The color drained from his face, and after a moment of trembling, he confessed. It turned out Jason was the one who had really been accepted to college. Emily had helped Mark steal his admission notice. When Jason took the exam again the next year, he discovered the truth and confronted Mark, who then murdered him to keep the secret. The truth hit me like a storm. So that was what really happened in my last life. Thankfully, this time, it wasn't too late. 2 weeks later, Jason recovered enough to be discharged from the hospital. He didn't remember a word about the dreams he'd told me before, and was shocked when I told him that Mark had stolen his admission letter, and that he had been sentenced to death for multiple crimes, including attempted assault. I nodded and added, "Yes," and Emily was sentenced to 30 years for aiding and abetting him. The verdict's already been issued. They were so terrified in custody that they confessed everything, even that they were never really siblings. They'd been living as husband and wife in secret all along. So not only were they punished by the law, but their parents couldn't bear the shame either. They packed up and left town overnight. Jason was still in disbelief, but I hadn't expected much else. He was too honest and kind to react with anger. I simply placed the college admission letter in his hands. It wasn't until he held it, realizing it was truly his, that he came back to his senses. Hugging me tightly, he said, "Claire, you're my lucky star. If it weren't for you, I would never have known that I was accepted to college in the first place." When I thought about the verdict, I couldn't help but feel emotional. Mark had destroyed my entire previous life, and even taken Jason's. In this life, he finally paid for his crimes with his own. Emily had deceived me and caused me 30 years of suffering, so she would spend 30 years behind bars. That must be what people call karma. Not long after, Mark's death sentence was carried out. Jason, with his rightful admission letter, went off to college. I accompanied him, and we rented a small apartment near campus. Without a family to serve or anyone to take care of, I was finally free to focus on my own studies. A year later, I too passed the entrance exam and was admitted to college. Together, Jason and I finally welcomed the beautiful life that belonged to us.